Welcome back, guys. Support me by clicking the subscribe button and getting me to 1,000 subscribers. Thank you so much. Patrick Mahomes played in 8 national windows last season, and those 8 games outrated entire primetime slates for other franchises. So when he tore his knee in Week 15, the question wasn't just whether he'd be ready for Week 1. It was what the league was supposed to do with the schedule built around him. "We're holding a few things until we know more," is how one broadcast executive put it when asked about the Chiefs' early season slots. On the surface, it sounds cautious. Once you understand what those few things are worth, it sounds like something else entirely. Every update has focused on the surgery, the rehab, the optimism. What nobody is saying out loud is why the league office is waiting on one medical report before it locks in the most valuable windows of the year. Every conversation around Kansas City has circled the same point: the timeline. The surgery happened fast, the swelling responded well, and the early rehab clips looked like the usual off-season optimism. Reporters framed it as a race against the opener, the kind of storyline fans can track week by week without ever questioning the premise. The Chiefs kept the messaging steady. No panic, no hedging, just the familiar rhythm of a franchise that has lived in January for half a decade. The entire football world settled into the idea that this was a medical countdown, nothing more complicated than a superstar trying to beat the clock. The public version of the story has been built on the same beats we've heard for years: elite athlete, elite training staff, elite recovery plan. Fans point to past injuries he played through. Analysts compare timelines from similar surgeries, and the conversation stays locked on whether he'll jog, throw, or cut by a certain date. It's the kind of narrative that feels complete because it has numbers, benchmarks, and a clear finish line. The surface logic is so familiar that nobody stops to ask whether the timeline is even the real issue. The assumption is simple: if Mahomes is ready, the Chiefs are fine. And if he's not, the Chiefs adjust. That's why the discourse has stayed narrow. Beat writers track practice participation. National shows debate whether the opener is realistic. And fans argue about how much mobility he actually needs to run the offense. Everything is framed as a football problem with a football solution. The consensus is so strong that it hides the larger truth. The people most affected by Mahomes' recovery aren't in Kansas City, and they aren't wearing helmets. They're the ones who decide which games go where, which networks get which windows, and which matchups carry the weight of the league's biggest contracts. The first sign that the surface story didn't hold came from a place fans rarely pay attention to: the schedule room. When a broadcast executive said, "We're holding a few things until we know more," it sounded like a harmless bit of caution. But the league doesn't hold anything in February unless something bigger is at stake. Those early season windows are usually locked in with confidence, especially when they involve the defending champions. The idea that one medical update could freeze decisions that affect multiple networks should have stopped everyone in their tracks. Instead, it passed by as a footnote. Then came the second crack in the consensus. Networks that normally fight for the first shot at Kansas City weren't planting their flags. They were waiting, not negotiating, not jockeying, not leaking preferred matchups, waiting. That doesn't happen in a league where every primetime slot is a battle for rating share and advertiser leverage. The Chiefs aren't just another draw, they're the anchor that props up entire nights of programming. When those partners hesitate, it's not because they're worried about a quarterback missing a week. It's because the quarterback in question is tied to decisions worth billions. And that's the moment the surface story collapses. The injury isn't just about whether Mahomes can plant off his left leg in September. It's about why the league office is treating his recovery like a variable that could destabilize the most valuable windows of the season. The consensus can explain the rehab timeline. It cannot explain why the NFL's scheduling machine, the most rigid, rehearsed, and financially engineered process in American sports, is suddenly acting like it needs permission to move forward. That gap is the break. And once you see it, the entire story shifts. The moment you step outside the injury timeline, the real picture comes into focus. The Chiefs aren't just a successful franchise, they're the league's most reliable ratings engine. The team networks use to stabilize entire nights of programming. When Mahomes plays, casual fans watch, rival fans watch, neutral fans watch, and the numbers spike in ways that executives can model with mere mathematical certainty. That certainty is the foundation of how the NFL sells its most valuable windows. It's why the Chiefs appear in every slot that matters, why they're the first name mentioned in every negotiation, and why the league's partners treat their schedule like a financial instrument rather than a football calendar. That's the part the surface story never touches. The NFL didn't just promote Mahomes as the face of the league, it built infrastructure around him. Amazon used the Chiefs to legitimize Thursday night. Peacock used them to justify an exclusive playoff game. YouTube used them to launch Sunday Ticket. International games leaned on them to draw global audiences. These weren't marketing choices, they were structural decisions made with the assumption that Mahomes would be available, healthy, and dominant for the foreseeable future. The league treated him as a constant in an equation that never accounted for the possibility of a variable. And that's where the injury becomes something the consensus cannot explain. When a quarterback becomes the anchor for multiple billion-dollar contracts, his availability stops being a team concern and becomes a league concern. The NFL has never had a single player whose presence shaped the architecture of its broadcast model to this degree. Not even Brady carried this kind of weight, because Brady's peak coincided with a media landscape that didn't depend on one star to launch new platforms. Mahomes arrived at the exact moment the league needed a singular draw to stabilize a fragmented viewing environment, and the league built around him without ever acknowledging the risk. The deeper you look, the clearer the pattern becomes. The NFL's partners didn't just want the Chiefs, they needed them. They needed the guarantee of a quarterback who could deliver national numbers, regardless of opponent, weather, or storyline. They needed the certainty that a Mahomes game would outperform anything else they could place in that slot. That need shaped decisions that were supposed to be strategic, but ended up being dependent. The league didn't diversify its draws, it concentrated them. And concentration always creates exposure. Which brings us to the part nobody wants to say out loud. The NFL created a single point of failure without realizing it. The league assumed Mahomes would always be available because he always had been. It treated his durability as a given, his presence as a constant, and his stardom as a stabilizing force rather than a potential liability. When he tore his knee, the Chiefs lost their quarterback. The NFL lost the foundation of its broadcast plan. That's the new explanation. The injury didn't expose a weakness in Kansas City. It exposed a weakness in the league's entire media strategy. The NFL's public stance has always been that flexible scheduling protects the integrity of its broadcast windows. The league presents it as a safeguard, a mechanism that ensures fans get the best matchups and networks get the strongest ratings. On paper, it sounds like a system built to absorb uncertainty, but the evidence tells a different story. Flexibility only works when the league has multiple reliable draws. Over the past 5 years, the NFL has quietly reduced that pool to one. The Chiefs became the default answer to every programming question, and the league treated that dependence as a strength rather than a warning. Inside the league office, the incentives are clear. Networks pay for certainty, not potential. They want matchups that guarantee viewership, not games that might deliver. Mahomes provided that certainty in a way no other player could. He turned every broadcast into a safe investment, every primetime slot into a predictable win. The league's partners responded by building their most valuable windows around him, and the league rewarded that behavior by giving them what they wanted. Over time, the system stopped distributing value and started funneling it toward one franchise, one quarterback, one narrative. That's the gap between what the NFL says it optimizes for and what the evidence shows. The league claims it protects competitive balance and broadcast parity, but its scheduling decisions reveal a different priority: maximizing the return on its most bankable asset. That priority shaped the last round of media deals, influenced the rollout of new platforms, and guided the placement of international games. It created a structure where the Chiefs weren't just a top draw, they were the draw. And once a system becomes dependent on a single output, it stops functioning like a league and starts functioning like a market built around one product. The injury forced the league to confront a reality it had been avoiding. Flexible scheduling can't protect a system that has concentrated its value in one place. The NFL can reshuffle matchups, adjust kickoff times, and move games across networks, but none of those tools solve the underlying problem. The league built a broadcast model that assumes Mahomes is available. When he isn't, the model doesn't bend, it stalls. That's why executives are waiting. That's why networks are hesitant. That's why the schedule room is quieter than usual. The system isn't flexible, it's exposed. And that exposure raises a question the league has never had to answer. What happens when the main character gets hurt? Not the star of a team, not the face of a franchise, the central figure in a media strategy worth more than $10 billion. The NFL built a structure that treats Mahomes as an economic constant. His injury revealed that he's a variable. And once a system built on certainty is forced to confront uncertainty, the incentives that shaped it become impossible to ignore. The expected evidence is the part everyone already thinks they understand. Mahomes tore his ACL and LCL in Week 15, had surgery the next day, and began rehab under a timeline that ranges anywhere from 7 to 9 months, depending on the athlete. The Chiefs have kept their messaging steady. The medical staff has projected confidence, and the public has treated the injury like a familiar storyline with a familiar arc. Fans track the rehab clips, analysts compare recovery windows, and the conversation stays locked on the same predictable checkpoints. This is the evidence that fits neatly inside the consensus, the part that makes the surface story feel complete. But the complicating evidence starts to appear the moment you look beyond Kansas City. The league's broadcast partners didn't just slow down their scheduling process, they paused it. Networks that normally fight for the first Chiefs game of the season were suddenly quiet, waiting for information that had nothing to do with competitive balance and everything to do with viewership guarantees. The Chiefs weren't being treated like a strong draw, they were being treated like the draw. That shift doesn't happen because of a quarterback's rehab timeline. It happens because the league's partners know exactly how much their most valuable windows depend on one player's availability. The next layer of evidence comes from the platforms that built their launches around Kansas City. Amazon's Thursday night slate leaned on the Chiefs to stabilize a product that had struggled in previous years. Peacock used the Chiefs playoff game to justify an exclusive window that required millions of fans to sign up on the spot. YouTube's Sunday ticket rollout featured Kansas City as the centerpiece of its marketing push. These weren't coincidences. They were deliberate choices made by companies that needed a guaranteed ratings engine to justify massive investments. And every one of those choices assumed Mahomes would be available. Then there's the international component. The league has spent years trying to expand its global footprint, and the Chiefs have been at the center of that effort. International games are planned months in advance, but the league hesitated to lock in Kansas City for a marquee slot because Mahomes' availability could swing the entire event. That hesitation is evidence of something deeper than caution. It's evidence of a system that has tied its global ambitions to one quarterback, one brand, one storyline. When the league delays decisions that normally run on rails, it's because the underlying assumptions have been disrupted. All of this evidence points to a single conclusion. The NFL didn't just elevate Mahomes, it built a structure that depends on him. The complicating evidence explains the hesitation, and the synthesis reveals the truth the consensus can't touch. The league's most valuable windows, platforms, and expansion efforts were constructed on the assumption that Mahomes would always be available. His injury didn't just challenge a timeline, it challenged the foundation of decisions worth more than $10 billion. This is where the story stops being about the Chiefs and becomes a question about the league's entire model. If one quarterback's injury can freeze scheduling decisions, unsettle broadcast partners, and disrupt international planning, then the NFL has created a structure far more fragile than it admits. The league has always sold itself as a system built on parity, depth, and interchangeable stars. But the behavior of its partners tells a different story. They aren't waiting on Kansas City, they're waiting on Mahomes. And that distinction exposes a vulnerability the league never intended to create. The consequence of that vulnerability is already visible. Networks that once treated primetime as a rotating showcase now treat it as a product tied to a single performer. Streaming platforms that were supposed to diversify the league's reach instead concentrated their biggest bets on one team. International events that were meant to broaden the league's appeal became dependent on a single quarterback's availability. These aren't isolated decisions. They're symptoms of a system that has allowed one player to become the stabilizing force for multiple revenue streams. And when that stabilizing force is injured, the system doesn't adjust, it stalls. The deeper consequence is what this reveals about the league's internal incentives. The NFL didn't set out to create a single point of failure. It drifted into one. Every partner wanted the safest possible ratings anchor. Every negotiation pushed the Chiefs higher in the hierarchy. Every platform needed a guaranteed draw to justify its investment. Over time, those incentives aligned in a way that made Mahomes the center of gravity for decisions that were supposed to be distributed across the league. The injury didn't create the exposure, it revealed it. And that revelation forces a question the league has never had to confront. What happens when the main character gets hurt? Not the star of a team, not the face of a franchise, the central figure in a media strategy worth more than $10 billion. The NFL built a broadcast model that treats Mahomes as a constant. His injury proved he's a variable. And once a system built on certainty is forced to confront uncertainty, the consequences ripple far beyond a single season. Which leads to the pivot the viewer feels but hasn't yet named. This isn't a story about Mahomes' recovery, it's a story about the league's dependence. The injury didn't expose a weakness in Kansas City, it exposed a weakness in the NFL's entire media architecture. And the next decision the league makes, the one it hasn't announced yet, will tell you exactly how deep that dependence runs. The story circles back to the place it began, but it doesn't look the same anymore. The updates about Mahomes' knee, the rehab optimism, the week one speculation, they feel smaller now, almost like background noise to a much larger machine. The injury didn't just interrupt a timeline, it exposed the assumptions the league built into its most valuable decisions. The viewer who started this video thinking about a quarterback's recovery now sees a system that tied its stability to one player without ever acknowledging the risk. The surface story collapses under the weight of the structural one. Inside the league office, the incentives haven't changed. The schedule still needs to be finalized. The networks still need their anchor games, and the platforms still need the matchups they paid for. But the confidence that usually drives those decisions has been replaced by hesitation. The people who shape the NFL's calendar aren't waiting for a medical update because they care about Kansas City's opener. They're waiting because the absence of one quarterback reshapes the value of windows that were supposed to be immune to uncertainty. The system is revealing its own dependence in real time. And then there's the human loop, the part that never leaves the frame. Mahomes is rehabbing under pressure that didn't come from his team or his fan base. It came from the league's decision to build its media strategy around him. Every step he takes, every clip that circulates, every optimistic quote carries weight far beyond the Chiefs' season. He didn't ask to become the stabilizing force for a $10 billion structure, but the league treated him like one. And now his recovery is being watched by people whose jobs have nothing to do with football and everything to do with the business built on top of it. So the question that hangs over the league isn't whether Mahomes will be ready for week 1. It's what happens the next time the NFL builds its most valuable windows around a single star, and that star becomes a variable instead of a constant. The evidence shows how the system reached this point. The next few months will show whether the league learned anything from it. If you've watched this far, you already see the argument. The injury didn't expose a weakness in Kansas City. It exposed a weakness in the NFL's entire media architecture. The only thing left is whether the league admits it or keeps pretending the problem is just a knee.